I was raised in a small Midwestern hamlet, a place of sprawling fields and a tightly knit populace. My formative years were a blend of the mundane and the ambitiously aspirational. My parents, while not affluent, instilled within me a profound sense of drive and diligence. My father, a former serviceman, recounted tales of perseverance, and my mother was the bedrock of our household, the one who kept us all united. High school marked the beginning of my self-discovery. I excelled in mathematical and scientific disciplines, nurturing a dream of becoming an engineer. My closest companion Jace and I would spend countless hours conceptualizing fantastical contraptions and charting our futures. He was the daring one, always testing the limits, whereas I favored the security of well-defined parameters and predictable outcomes. Post-graduation, our paths diverged in unforeseen ways. Jace enlisted in the armed forces, while I embarked on my engineering studies. However, financial hardships and youthful missteps led me to a turning point, and I too found myself enlisting. The Army served as a forge, shaping me into a more robust, yet also more guarded, individual. By the time I returned to my hometown, I was fundamentally altered. The guilelessness of my youth had been supplanted by the gravity of experience. I channeled my newfound energy into my education, eventually securing a position at General Motors, where I encountered Sally. She was a beacon in my life, bringing vibrancy to the muted tones that had come to characterize my existence. Together, we cultivated a shared existence, a family, and a dwelling, a life I once considered impregnable. A gradual awareness began to return, as if I were surfacing from a dense mist. The faint illumination emanating from the basement workshop, visible through the crack in the door, seemed to mirror my somber disposition. Beyond the wooden partition, a racket lay secured in its vise, a relic from an earlier work session. I could discern the indistinct sounds of our two youngest children engaged with a Disney film in the recreation room. Settled in my accustomed armchair, I noted the time. I had been there for well over 30 minutes, lost in contemplation, attempting to block out any unwelcome thoughts. Dinner had concluded, and Sally had handled the cleanup while I retreated to the basement to re-glue a few rackets for the autumn racquetball tournaments. I had participated in these leagues for years, typically competing in the A bracket, and took considerable pride in my proficiency and physical condition. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighing approximately 200 pounds, I maintained a good level of fitness, despite the demands of my engineering career at GM. Our 7-year-old daughter, Jessie, descended to join her younger sister, Allie, in watching a movie. At this age, Allie invariably trailed Jessie, and I couldn't help but ponder how things would evolve as Jessie matured. Our 9-year-old son, Jason, being the eldest, typically sequestered himself in his room to construct model airplanes. I completed the grip adjustments on my 3 rackets, meticulously tightening the strings in anticipation of a potential mid-match string breakage. Upon checking on the girls, I observed they were engrossed in Lady and the Tramp, so I decided to ascend to the upper level. As I made my way up the staircase, I overheard Sally conversing on the telephone. I momentarily considered presenting her with a surprise, setting a romantic ambiance for later, despite having already shared an intimate moment that morning. However, as I cautiously peeked through the doorway, I heard Sally's laughter. I froze. Her laughter was distinct, familiar, yet disconcerting. Then I heard her whisper, "I'd certainly like to try that thing again before the wart comes off." That peculiar utterance brought to mind a conversation I'd had in a bar a couple of months prior. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over me, and I stumbled on the basement stairs, closing the door quietly behind me. Sally's laughter continued, her voice deepening, and I could only catch fragments of her words. "Last time I was really on a roll. I can't wait." Wanting to conceal my presence, I quietly retreated to my workshop, replaying the conversation in my mind. It reminded me of an evening after a racquetball match, when I had been at a local establishment with John and Craig. After discussing the game, the conversation veered towards our spouses. I noticed that John and Craig seemed unusually inquisitive about my marriage, though their demeanor wasn't flirtatious. Their pointed questions made me uneasy, and I had left early on several occasions to steer clear of the topic. That particular night, Craig was playfully teasing John about his wife, Mary, insisting he undergo a personal procedure. I assumed it was a vasectomy and casually mentioned that Sally had broached the subject of me undergoing one, but we hadn't reached a decision. Craig continued to smirk, while John appeared troubled. "Oh no, she wants him to remove the wart," Craig remarked, chuckling. Confused, I inquired, "What's going on?" John, blushing, explained that he had a growth in a sensitive area that he had observed developing over the years, and now Mary was insistent on its removal. John wasn't as concerned about the financial aspect as he was about losing his perceived advantage in attracting other women, as the wart apparently served as a point of interest. Realizing the discomfort the conversation was causing me, I decided to depart. Now, sitting in the dim light, I found it difficult to comprehend that Sally might be involved in something aligning with her phone conversation. Sally knew John and Craig through racquetball, but I hadn't believed they had ever met her. The disparate pieces began to fall into place, and I could no longer dismiss the possibility of an ongoing affair. My brow beaded with sweat as I desperately hoped for a logical explanation, but Debbie, Sally's supervisor, was clearly implicated. Debbie had been with the company for 5 years and had become a close confidant of Sally's. They had bonded during their respective pregnancies, and their families had socialized on a few occasions, though our interactions were never particularly close. John and Craig had joined the Women's Racquetball League a couple of years prior. Despite our similar family circumstances, we only interacted at games or afterward over drinks, never with our families present. It was only recently, when I casually mentioned the store where Sally worked, that I discovered Debbie was an acquaintance of John and Craig. They had attended the same high school, and John mentioned that they encountered each other a few times annually. Approximately 2 years ago, when Allie was navigating the challenging toddler phase, Sally was experiencing considerable strain. Jessie was attending daycare, and I was working extended hours. One evening, overwhelmed by exhaustion, Sally broke down. After offering words of comfort, I suggested taking full responsibility for the children on her upcoming day off, enabling her to have a respite. She expressed her gratitude and stated she would contemplate my offer. A couple of weeks later, Sally informed me that she had spoken with Debbie about her need for a break. Debbie proposed a shopping excursion to the upscale boutiques in Detroit. Although I harbored reservations, I agreed. Sally and Debbie departed on a Saturday morning, checked into a motel, enjoyed dinner, and attended a movie. I insisted on obtaining the hotel's details, which she duly provided. The following day, they checked out, visited another mall, and returned home by 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Sally expressed her gratitude for the excursion and embraced me upon our return home, recounting every detail. She mentioned that she hadn't indulged in excessive shopping but had acquired a few cherished items for herself and the children. I was pleased she'd enjoyed her time and that the kids had behaved well, leaving me with no grounds for complaint. Over 2 years prior, following Sally's inaugural shopping expedition with Debbie, these trips had become a recurring event, occurring every few months. They would depart on Saturday mornings and return late Sunday. I didn't much object. I relished the time spent with the children, and Sally appeared content. Initially, I couldn't pinpoint any significant shifts in her demeanor, but after the second trip, Sally returned in a noticeably altered mood, sulky and somewhat anxious. When I inquired, she dismissed my concerns, attributing it to the onset of her period. I then recalled that since that time, we had refrained from being intimate on the nights she returned, though we were consistently intimate a few days before her departure. This hadn't registered significantly until this moment. Sally's voice called from the top of the staircase. "Phil, it's bath time for the girls. Could you send them up?" I let out a sigh and ascended the stairs to round them up. I made an effort to maintain my composure, but a turmoil of emotions was building within me. Upon my return, Sally was in the kitchen, perusing a cookbook. She offered a smile, met my gaze, and asked, "Is something troubling you, honey?" I mumbled something about a damaged racket, but continued to scrutinize her, seeking any telltale signs. She appeared perfectly normal, just my wife. She kissed me, and casually mentioned that Debbie had called to arrange another shopping excursion. As she uttered this, her eyes narrowed, and she quickly averted her gaze. I recognized then that something was amiss and began to wonder how long this had been ongoing. I attempted to steer the conversation in a different direction. "Do we have anything planned for next weekend?" I asked. She stated that there was nothing on the calendar. I proposed attending a VFW event on Saturday, but she expressed no interest. "I don't care if your father goes," she declared. "I'm not attending. It bores me to tears." I persisted, suggesting a family outing to Cedar Point, but Sally became defensive. "We just took the kids to Maple Island. What has gotten into you, Phil? You've never minded me shopping before." Frustration mounting, I conceded. "Never mind. I just thought we could do something together." She walked away, remarking, "You and Debbie are having fun. I'll go check on the kids." That evening, I feigned sleep, but found myself unable to stop thinking. I heard Sally join me in bed and whisper my name, but I remained still. Eventually, she shifted away, and I lay awake, replaying everything in my mind. I contemplated my childhood, growing up just a few miles from our current residence. I had a typical middle-class upbringing with my parents and an older sister. My best friend Jace lived a block away, and we were inseparable. He was the gregarious, life-of-the-party type, while I was more reserved and contemplative. We spent our youth playing sports, chasing girls, and ultimately, both lost our virginity before our high school prom. In high school, I began taking drafting classes, deciding I wanted to pursue a career as an engineer. Jace was uncertain about his path, but we both enrolled in community college. After my first year, I made a significant error in judgment. I was arrested for driving under the influence following a party and spent the night in jail. My parents posted my bail and they were furious. In the aftermath, I exhausted all my savings on fines and court fees, and my driver's license was suspended for a year. For the remainder of the semester, I relied on my moped, giving Jace rides. Eventually, I abandoned my studies. It seemed pointless without a license or funds. The following year, I enlisted in the Army, hoping my drafting skills would secure me an engineering position and keep me out of Vietnam. The recruiter, of course, lied. Jace decided to enlist with me, and we joined as buddies, guaranteed to train together. Basic training was demanding but manageable. During aptitude assessments, the Army determined we would be effective fire control specialists, a role involving operating sophisticated calculators to aid artillery in targeting. Following this, we were dispatched to Fort Sill for further training. It wasn't an ideal experience, but Jace and I found ways to enjoy ourselves. A few weeks before graduation, we received our deployment orders for Vietnam. After a brief respite at home, we flew to Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam, where we were assigned to Battery A, 2nd Battalion, 11th Artillery. It was November of 1969, and Nixon was implementing troop reductions. For the initial few months, there was minimal combat, consisting primarily of extensive patrolling and a few isolated raids. The highlight of our tour was an exhilarating vacation in Bangkok. Subsequently, our unit was redeployed to a remote jungle hilltop, and the situation took a grim turn. 4 months later, I returned home on a stretcher, and Jace was deceased. I was mentally and physically shattered. I spent weeks in the hospital and months undergoing rehabilitation. After being declared nearly fit for duty, I returned to Fort Sill as an assistant instructor. I enrolled in college courses to occupy my time, deliberately avoiding social interactions. After a year, I applied for early release from the Army and was accepted into an engineering program at a local university. I moved back in with my parents, living off my savings, educational benefits, and a part-time job. I embodied the classic shell-shocked Vietnam veteran, bitter, withdrawn, and grappling with my experiences. I grew a beard, wore worn clothing, and isolated myself. I saw a therapist periodically, but I didn't feel it was particularly helpful. I made regular visits to Jace's parents to discuss him. It was the least I could do. One day, while studying in the campus center, a woman approached and asked if she could join me. She possessed striking red hair and a pale complexion. I was immediately captivated by her, but when she inquired if I was a Vietnam veteran, I recoiled. "Yes," I replied, but offered no further details. She mentioned her father was a Korean War veteran, which eased my apprehension somewhat. We conversed for a while until she had to leave for class. A couple of days later, she returned and asked if she could sit with me again. This time I was more at ease, and we chatted as if we were old acquaintances. Eventually, she realized she didn't know my name, so I introduced myself. "Phil Robinson," I stated. "Sally Baxter," she replied with a laugh. And just like that, I met Sally. It transpired that Sally and I both had lengthy breaks between classes on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Over the ensuing weeks, we spent most of these breaks together. She shared nearly everything about her life, family, friends, career aspirations, and I was fascinated by her outgoing social nature. She reminded me so much of Jace. I spoke about my family and classes, but I deliberately avoided discussing the Army. I much preferred listening to her. Her voice could have read me the phone book, and I would still have been engrossed. Gradually, I began to take better care of myself, shaving, getting a haircut, and dressing more presentably. My mother noticed and teased me, but she was clearly delighted for me. A few weeks into our acquaintance, I finally asked her out. She accepted immediately but cautioned, "My dad can be tough on guys who ask me out." I responded, "If dating you means dealing with your father, it's worth it." She blushed and called me a flatterer. That Friday, I knocked on her door and was warmly welcomed by her mother, Emily, before I could even speak. She called out, "Jack, Sally's beau is here." Emily introduced herself, and we shook hands. Soon, Sally's father, Jack, appeared. He was tall, about my height, but considerably heavier, and his presence was imposing. He shook my hand firmly and invited me into the family room. As we sat, I observed military memorabilia, including a Marine Corps flag and an M1 Garand rifle, displayed proudly above the fireplace. Jack, a Korean War veteran, spoke of his service and injuries, and I briefly mentioned my Vietnam service. We discussed military history, and Jack seemed skeptical, even dismissive of my role. He muttered about Vietnamization and the war's conclusion, but Emily attempted to steer the conversation away from politics. Sally entered, and we quickly shifted our focus to school. After some time, we bid our goodbyes. I took Sally out for dinner and a movie. The evening was largely a blur, as my attention was entirely focused on her. We held hands, sitting so close that our heads nearly touched. Afterward, we stopped at a bar for a drink, and I walked her to her door. I hesitated, unsure whether to kiss her, but she reached up, wrapped her arms around my neck, and whispered, "Thank you for a wonderful evening." Time seemed to stand still as I gazed into her eyes, realizing I had fallen in love with her. I kissed her gently, and from that moment on, we shared intimate moments like that, holding each other close, unable to conceal our feelings. The following day, I called Sally, and we spoke for an hour. We quickly made plans for another date, and just like that, we became exclusive. A few weeks later, when I suggested booking a motel room for the weekend, she blushed, but smiled and nodded. The evening was everything I had hoped for, though there were a few awkward moments when she noticed the scars from Vietnam. I reassured her that I was fine. I whispered, "Sally, I love you. I can't help it." She pulled back, tears welling in her eyes, and smiled. "I love you too, Phil. I never knew it could be like this." Relieved, I kissed her nose and said, "I want to do this again and again." That night was perfect. For the first time since losing Jace, I felt a sense of peace. We discussed our future, marriage, children, and where we would live. Sally was graduating soon, and I would follow a year later. We decided she would work after graduation, and we would marry when I finished school. In the interim, I rented an apartment so we could be together. A week later, I introduced Sally to my parents. They hit it off immediately, and my mother later told me she adored Sally for how she had brought me out of my shell. I was happy again, smiling constantly, to the point that my therapist dismissed me, stating I no longer required his assistance. Sally's father, Jack, and I had a strained relationship. He was protective, particularly when we discussed living together before marriage. But things shifted when Jack invited me over for a private conversation. After some initial pleasantries, Jack mentioned that Sally had confided in him about my scars. I felt uneasy, but Jack seemed understanding. We briefly discussed my time in Vietnam, and I informed him that I had been at RIPT in the summer of '70. To my surprise, Jack was familiar with it. From that point on, he treated me like family. Events progressed rapidly. Sally graduated with honors, secured a job, and spent more time with me. Her parents, however, felt she should move in with me permanently. I graduated on time, obtained employment at General Motors, and 2 months later, we were married. We purchased a modest house, and a year later, our son, Jason, was born. 2 years after that, we welcomed Jesse, followed by Allison 3 years later. The arrival of our children altered everything. Sally worked part-time after Jason was born and planned to return to full-time employment once the children were older. Meanwhile, my career evolved as I transitioned into automated manufacturing. By the time Allison was born, I was part of a team learning about the early computer-aided design systems. Life was good. We had ample financial resources, 2 cars, and a comfortable home. Over the years, we expanded our living space with a new bedroom, bathroom, and recreation room. We had 3 healthy, beautiful children and embarked on family vacations annually. Twice a year, Sally and I would send the children to their grandparents for extended weekends. I had always considered our marriage to be strong. We openly expressed our love for each other, holding hands, embracing, and sharing affection. I often told Sally how fortunate I felt, but recently, I wasn't so sure anymore. Sleep became elusive, and I spent most nights staring at the wall, getting hardly any rest. I skipped my usual morning workout and instead sat at my desk, trying to decipher what was going wrong. I couldn't directly ask Sally if she was concealing something. She might not offer the truth. I wasn't even certain what the truth entailed, but a sinking feeling suggested something was amiss. I loved Sally and the children. The thought of losing them terrified me. But the notion that Sally might no longer love me was even more frightening. For days, I felt like a zombie, distracted and disconnected from everything. It wasn't until Jace commented on my behavior that Sally noticed. I brushed it off as work-related stress. On Tuesday, I returned to my routine and played racquetball. John and Craig were there as usual. I had never seen one without the other, and something about their closeness began to unsettle me. They acted as if they shared some secret, and when they smirked at me, I started to perceive them as rivals. We played a few casual games, but my mind was elsewhere. By Wednesday, I resolved to ascertain their whereabouts. I called John's house, and his wife informed me he was attending a business conference in Detroit. When I called Craig's house, I received the same response. My heart sank. I didn't need concrete proof. This was it. I knew they had met up, but how far had things progressed? I was enraged. A voice within me urged, "Do something." On Friday, I stopped by my parents' house. They were undertaking renovations in preparation for a potential relocation to Florida, but I needed their support. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, I finally blurted out, "I suspect Sally is having an affair." The words seemed to shatter something within me, and I wept for the first time. My parents were shocked. Mom whispered, "No, not Sally. She wouldn't do that to you." Dad inquired, "Why do you believe that?" I recounted everything, what I had overheard and what I had discovered. Mom cried quietly and Dad comforted her, asking, "What do you need from us?" "I need to be certain. Can you take the kids tomorrow and keep them until Sunday? I need to be where they'll be tomorrow night." Dad hesitated before agreeing. "Sure, Phil, but I pray this is all a misunderstanding." "Yeah, me too," I replied, though I wasn't convinced it could be. I departed feeling hollow, uncertain of what lay ahead. Upon my return home, Sally was cheerfully concluding dinner. She greeted me with a hug and a kiss, saying, The kids are in the break room. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. She seemed preoccupied, practically radiating energy. It struck me that we hadn't been intimate since the previous Saturday, and we had missed our usual midweek rendezvous. I had been in a foul mood all week, taking sleeping pills to get through the nights, and Sally had never mentioned it. I hesitated, then suggested, "How about we put the kids to bed early and have some time to ourselves tonight?" Sally stepped back, and her smile faltered. "I got my period early today," she stated, clearly uncomfortable. I forced a smile. "Okay, I understand." She gently stroked my cheek and promised, "As soon as my period is over, I'll explain everything." I nodded, muttering, "Then it's a date." She hugged me and returned to her cooking. I slowly headed upstairs, anger simmering within me. I now knew she was saving herself for tomorrow's engagement. The voice in my head grew louder. Do something. At dinner, I struggled to conceal my emotions. The children chattered away, oblivious. Could this be the last family dinner we shared? The thought brought tears to my eyes. The following day, we followed our usual Saturday routine. The children cleaned their rooms, then watched cartoons. I spent time in the garage until Sally was ready to depart. She came downstairs with her suitcase, reminding the children to behave while she was away. Allie clung to her, demanding she buy her something. Sally promised, kissed Allie goodbye, and left for the hotel. I watched her drive off, holding Allie in my arms. Once she was out of sight, I turned to the children and informed them we were going to Grandma and Grandpa's house for the night. They packed quickly, and we headed out. At my parents' house, Dad gave me a concerned look. "Good luck, Phil. I hope you're wrong." "I hope so too," I replied. "Thanks for helping. I'll call you in the morning." I left, switching cars at Avis to avoid recognition. Back home, I sat in the kitchen, replaying the week's events. The phone finally rang around 1 a.m. It was Sally. "Is that you, Phil?" "Yeah, it's me. Is everything okay?" I asked, with a hint of sarcasm. "We're fine. We stopped for lunch. We're in room 168, 555-6450-0168, she replied before rushing off. "Debbie's waving at me. We're spending the afternoon at Meadowbrook Shopping Center. I'll see you tomorrow." The phone clicked off without her saying, "I love you." That morning, she hadn't said it either. I dialed the Red Roof Inn, confirming Sally had checked in. I decided I wouldn't call her room. I'd see her later. I hung up, then dialed again. I called the Red Roof Inn once more, asking if John Harrison was registered. They confirmed he was, but hadn't checked in yet. I said I'd call back later and hung up, trying to suppress the rising anger that felt like it could explode at any moment. I went into the workshop, unlocked the tool cabinet, and stood staring at my dad's old rifle. I considered taking one with me, but the thought of never seeing my children again stopped me. Instead, I grabbed a worn shoebox from a drawer and pulled out a combat knife I'd purchased in Bangkok. I strapped it to my calf, then gathered a few things: driving gloves, water, candy bars, and headed out at 2 p.m. for the 90-mile drive to Rochester Hills. I parked near the Red Roof Inn by room 168 but didn't see Sally's car. I waited, thinking about her and the children. Around 5, I saw John and Craig arrive in a red pickup, laughing and unloading bags. They went into a nearby room, and after about 45 minutes, they left. I followed them to Tupper's Pub, where I parked on the street and waited. Soon I spotted Sally's car and parked so I could see both it and the truck. I debated going inside but stayed in the car, listening to country songs that matched my mood. At 9 p.m., the 4 of them finally emerged, laughing and holding hands. I decided to beat them back to the hotel. I parked, and 10 minutes later, they pulled in. I watched them outside, talking and laughing under the light by room 1. John tossed a coin, and Craig kissed Sally. Debbie grabbed John's hand, and they all dispersed into different rooms, still laughing. My mind raced. Was this some kind of game? The pain hit hard, and the voice in my head screamed, "Do something!" I couldn't undo what had happened. 10 years of marriage, a family, all ruined. What good would confronting them do now? At least I would know the truth. Then, John emerged from Debbie's room, holding a beer, dressed in boxer shorts. He walked over to Sally's room and knocked. A few minutes later, Craig emerged from Debbie's room, shirtless and barefoot. They spoke briefly before high-fiving each other. John went into Sally's room, and Craig returned to Debbie's. Suddenly, it hit me. I had completely lost control. A voice screamed in my head, "Do something!" I felt a surge of madness, unable to stop myself. I put on my driving gloves, got out of the car, and walked directly to room 168. I covered the peephole with my thumb and knocked twice. As the door began to open and John said, "What the hell, Craig?" I threw a punch, kicking him with all my anger. John stumbled back and fell to the floor, hands over his face. I noticed the disarray in the room, the overturned bed, the bathroom door slightly ajar, and the shower running. I unsheathed my knife and tapped it against John's nose. His eyes widened in fear. "How long, John? How long has this been going on?" "Don't lie to me," I said coldly. 2 years, he stammered, eyes wide. "Joining the same racquetball league wasn't a coincidence?" "No," he whispered, closing his eyes in pain. I leaned in. "You're sick, John. Look at me." I paused. "If you ever go near Sally or any other married woman again, I'll find you and make sure you regret it. Understand?" "Yes," he wheezed, terrified. Suddenly, I smelled something foul. The shower stopped, and I heard Sally's voice. "Hey, John boy, I thought you were joining me in the shower." I turned just as Sally appeared in the bathroom doorway, a towel in hand, her face draining of color as she saw me. Shock overwhelmed her as the towel slipped to the floor. "John boy doesn't seem well," I growled, stepping toward her. Panic flashed in her eyes as she slammed the bathroom door shut. I walked over to the nightstand, cut the phone cord with my knife, and sheathed the blade. Then I stormed out, but not before throwing the phone violently against the bathroom door, causing a loud crash and a terrified scream from inside. I stepped outside, took a deep breath, and realized I wasn't done yet. I headed to the next room. I knocked on the door of Craig's room. When it opened, I punched him under the chin. He went down, and Debbie, wide-eyed and panicked, sat up in bed. I checked Craig's pulse. He was fading. I went to the nightstand, pulled the phone cord, and turned to Debbie. "If you tell your husband about tonight," I said sarcastically, "tell him I said hi." Then I added, "Or maybe I'll tell him myself." I tossed the phone into the corner and left. Outside, I looked up at the sky and took a deep breath. The tension gradually subsided. The voice in my head was silent now. Everything was done. It was time to move on with my life. As I made my way to the car, my phone rang. Annoyed, I answered. "Yeah, Phil, it's Jack," came the voice on the other end. "What's going on?" I asked, my tone uninterested. "Sally's at the house, crying. She says she's afraid to go home." I glanced at the clock. Almost 10 p.m., nearly 14 hours since I'd left Rochester Hills. "I don't know what I could have done," I muttered, feeling confused. "She says you hurt Debbie's friends badly last night." "Hurt them? They're lucky I didn't eliminate them," I shot back sarcastically. "What the hell? That's not like you," Jack responded, clearly shocked. I paused for a moment, then asked, "Did Sally tell you where the fight happened?" "She mentioned it was outside a restaurant in Rochester Hills, so she's trying to avoid it," Jack replied, his tone sharp. "Well, with her family and history," I trailed off. "Sally's your daughter, so I guess it must be true," I said slowly, sensing Jack was processing everything. "Phil, I'm bringing Sally home. We need to talk," Jack said. "No problem," I replied. "I'm not going anywhere." Jack hung up, but I heard Sally in the background. "No, Dad, no." I sighed. She's not making this easy. I thought I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking my second beer and looking through old photos, when Jack and Sally arrived. Sally clung to Jack's arm, pulling him toward the door. "Please, Dad, let us talk. Phil and I need some time alone." Sally was makeup-free, her hair loose, eyes red and swollen, shaking like a nervous wreck. She wouldn't look at me, trying to guide Jack back toward the door, but he sat down at the table, his eyes darting between me and the combat knife beside my beer. "Okay, Phil, what's going on?" Jack asked, his voice tight. I looked at Sally and mockingly said, "Yes, Sally, tell your dad what's going on." She snapped, "Shut up, Phil. You and I can work this out." Her commanding voice didn't match the pleading in her eyes. I was furious. The idea that she thought we could fix this alone, or that she could manipulate me, pushed me further. I was determined to be as honest as she had been dishonest. I turned to Jack. "Sally and her boss, Debbie, have a couple of girlfriends they go out with when they're out of town. I found out, and I didn't take it well." I paused, then added, "I might have been a little more polite than she deserved." Sally sighed, sitting down, her face falling. Jack looked at me in disbelief. "No, Phil, Sally wouldn't do that. I don't believe you." "Enough, Phil," Jack snapped, his anger rising. "You're being cruel." I stared at him, then shot back. "Cruel? You would have seen what I saw last night. Another man's footprints in her hotel room." I said it flatly. Jack's eyes flicked to Sally, and her panicked expression made it clear I was telling the truth. Jack slumped in his chair, his face crumpling as he covered it with his hands, whispering, "Oh, God." Sally's face turned pale. "Please, Dad, don't tell Mom. We can work this out, can't we?" "Please, Phil," she begged. I said nothing, just sifted through the old photos, lost in the pain of the past. After a few minutes, Jack straightened up, wiped his eyes, and asked, "What are you going to do, Phil?" He looked at Sally, whose tears hadn't stopped. I thought for a moment, then said, "I never told either of you about Vietnam or Ripcord. Hell, I never told anyone about Ripcord, not even my therapist." I waved at the pile of photos on the table. "Isn't it funny, Jack? Your generation proudly displays their war medals, while mine hides its memories in shoeboxes locked away." I picked up an old, faded photo of two young soldiers in jungle uniforms, smiling as if it were some casual outing. Jay and I were dropped at Ripcord in May 1971. It was just another base in our rotation. Set up tools, supported the troops, and moved on. I paused, looking at Jack. But this time it was different. We were stationed on a remote ridge near the Laos border, overlooking the A Shau Valley. It was a bad place for the U.S. military. Previous battles there had cost many lives. The Ripcord base was meant to support 4 battalions of the 101st Airborne, trying to stop the NVA from pushing down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I shook my head. What a joke. The base had our 155th Battery, a mortar platoon, and a company of infantry. We had 2 helicopter pads and a few other basic units, maybe 400 men at most. The whole base was underground bunkers, trenches, tunnels. We didn't know until later that we were surrounded by 12,000 NVA soldiers. I met Jack's eyes. "Does that remind you of anything, Jack? Like your Marines at Chosin Reservoir?" Jack nodded slowly, lost in thought. After a moment of silence, I spoke. "The first few weeks weren't so bad for us," I said. "But for those dropped into combat positions on the hills, it was hell. Helicopters were in and out from dawn till dusk. We only took occasional sniper or automatic fire, but the incoming anti-aircraft fire grew stronger." I looked at Jack, then continued. "On July 1st, everything changed. Just after 7 a.m., we took our first mortar fire. For the next week, the NVA bombarded us with 20 to 30 shells a day from 60 and 81 mm mortars. Then they started using 120 mm mortars, new weapons that had never been outside the DMZ. The worst part," I said, my voice trailing off, "was that you couldn't always hear the shells coming. The wind, helicopters, and artillery fire made it hard to tell. One day, I was running from the mess hall to the bunker when a mortar blast knocked me down. I got to the bunker, and Jace, looking up, said, "Damn, Phil, you're bleeding." I smiled weakly at the memory. I'd forgotten my body armor that day. "Never again," I added with a sigh. The shrapnel shot me under my right shoulder blade. They evacuated me to Camp Evans to have it removed. It wasn't serious, but they kept me for a couple of days for a concussion. By the time I returned to Ripcord, we were taking 70 to 80 shells a day. It got heavier. Mortars, rocket-propelled grenades, recoilless rifles. We were losing more men every day. Our mortars were firing non-stop. We were using so much ammo the batteries ran out in hours. Chinooks brought in more shells while 12.7 caliber NVA fire rained down on them. Once they dropped off ammo, we rushed in to load the mortars. I paused, recalling the chaos. During one of these operations, I took another half-dozen shrapnel wounds. Between the constant bombardment, our regular work, and bringing ammo to the mortars, we were beyond exhausted. Planes, F-4s, Phantoms, even B-52s were constantly around, bombing the hills. Smoke and tear gas from the NVA lingered in the air, and after July 8th, when we first spotted the dinks in the wire, we were on high alert. Every night we knew an attack was coming. We just didn't know when. The room was quiet, the weight of the moment settling in. Jack's face was grim, and Sally looked like she was bracing herself. I took a deep breath. As the shelling continued, we started taking serious casualties. Morale was plummeting. We felt abandoned. Before it was over, I said quietly, "We lost over 500 men, dead and wounded. I was assigned to carry body bags to the helipad for evacuation." I looked at Jack, my eyes filling. On July 18th, the worst thing happened. A Chinook carrying howitzer shells was hit and crashed over a battery and ammo supply point. The explosion was massive. The battery burst into flames, and explosions kept going for hours. All 6 mortars were destroyed, and dozens of men were injured. I paused, the image still vivid. We rushed to the battery to help. Many of the wounded had severe burns from the aviation fuel. Jace and I lifted one machine gunner onto a stretcher. When I grabbed his arm, the skin came off in my hand. The smell of burning flesh. I'll never forget it. Jack nodded gravely, his face filled with grief. Sally looked horrified as I spoke. I wiped my eyes and pressed on. We all knew this position wouldn't hold, but the brass didn't care. They saw it as a chance to hit the enemy. After all, we had almost 4 NVA regiments in one spot. A few nights later, I said, my voice growing colder, we went on high alert. We were hit with automatic weapons fire around the perimeter. Jace and I set up an M60 in a trench in front of the FDC bunker, ready for an attack. The mortar platoon kept firing flares, and the infantry returned fire along the jungle's edge. Every few minutes, I continued, artillery ships flew overhead, firing rockets and miniguns at suspicious targets. Jay and I didn't return fire often to avoid drawing attention to our position, especially since there wasn't an infantry squad just 20 to 30 yards ahead. "This night," I said, my tone distant. The infantry kept popping up and firing grenades and automatic weapons. Then suddenly 20 incoming mortar rounds hit their position. The ground shook as we dove into our foxhole. I paused, the danger still fresh in my mind. When we peeked out, the infantry trench was completely buried. We quickly took up firing positions, and Jace started shooting while I fed him ammo. The platoon sergeant crawled over, and we told him what happened. He nodded, ducked down, and rushed off for more ammo. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to continue. Just as we were finishing the last ammo belt, I heard an M16 shot. It felt like being hit with a baseball bat in my back and thighs. I collapsed on the edge of the trench, staring into Jace's eyes. I saw the realization in his face, but he couldn't speak. I held his hand. He squeezed it once, then the light left his eyes. I knew it was over. My throat tightened. My best friend, my brother, was gone. I felt completely alone. I wiped my eyes, hearing Sally sniffle, but I wasn't sure if it was for Jace or her own emotions. I took a deep breath and went on. I looked up to see Corporal Tran standing in front of us, an M16 aimed at us. Tran was one of Kit Carson's scouts, a North Vietnamese deserter. He fired a whole clip at us. I took a couple of bullets in my back, but my body armor saved me from worse, though I had broken ribs and a severe concussion. One bullet shot my thigh but didn't hit bone. I started to go into shock, realizing Jace was gone and I'd been shot. I paused, steadying myself. I fought to stay conscious. I couldn't let myself pass out. I focused on anger, thinking of getting revenge on the enemy. As the rage built, my vision blurred, and my mind clouded with hatred. Tran noticed I was moving and tried to shoot again, but he had emptied his clip. I played dead, and he must have decided I was finished. He dropped his rifle, jumped over our trench, and started waving a flashlight, shouting in Vietnamese. I pressed on, shaking as I recalled the chaos. Then a rocket-propelled grenade flew from the bushes, narrowly missing both of us. Tran kept waving his flashlight like a madman. Through the flare light, I saw 3 figures, sappers emerging from the jungle, wearing satchel charges and holding AK-47s. I barely had the strength to stand, but I grabbed the M60 beneath Jace and aimed at them. I fired 2 long bursts before the belt ran out. The sappers went down, and Tran stared at me, shocked. He screamed, spitting as he grabbed a machete from his belt. Most scouts carried them to navigate the jungle, I added. I barely had time to get my foot on the trench's edge and push off before Tran lunged at me. I dropped the M60 and grabbed my knife. We were almost unconscious, but I managed to get on top of him. He reached for the machete but never got it. I closed my eyes, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know how long I sat there, surrounded by the flickering light of flares, explosions, tracer rounds, howitzers rumbling, and the smell of cordite and burning debris. It felt like I was in hell. I continued hoarsely. Eric, my platoon sergeant, pulled me by one arm, and Lieutenant Dixon by the other. Dixon was shouting for me to get to the bunker. Napalm was coming, and we were too close to the wire. I took a sip of beer, tracing my knife across the purple hearts on the table. Jack and Sally were silent. I couldn't bring myself to look at them. I went on. That's when I lost consciousness. I woke up in a medical bunker with an IV in my arm. A battalion surgeon and corpsman were working on me. Doc said I'd probably survive and that they'd evacuate me at dawn. I added, my voice shaky. I was flown out around noon. Miraculously, every helicopter was under heavy fire. 2 had already been shot down. Mine took several hits, one that liquidated the crew commander, but by then, they decided to evacuate Ripcord. I paused, looking at Jack. They took everyone out on the 21st and bombed the place. I didn't care. 24 hours later, I was on a flight to Japan, then transferred to Walter Reed for a month. I sighed deeply. While I was there, some colonel, who probably never heard of Ripcord, handed me a medal for eliminating my enemies. I took the silver star from the box and placed it beside the purple hearts. It was the same one on Jack's mantle. I shook my head. The doctors treated me well, but mentally I wasn't fine. I had nightmares every night, couldn't shake the sounds, smells, and faces of the dead and wounded. I paused, looking away. I missed Jace's funeral but went home before reporting to Sil. Bass. I visited Jace's parents. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. They wanted to know about Vietnam, what happened to Jace, but didn't ask a single question. I swallowed, struggling to speak. Why did I survive and he didn't? I said softly. I ask myself that every day. I stared blankly ahead, lost in thought. I was in therapy, but felt withdrawn from the world. I did the bare minimum at Fort Sill and buried myself in college drafting to avoid socializing. When I left the Army, I moved back with my parents and went to school, not because I cared, but because I didn't know what else to do. I looked up at Sally. Then I met you, I whispered. Sally lowered her gaze, her voice trembling. You brought me back to life. You were happy, engaged in everything, beautiful inside and out. Everything I thought I wasn't. You made me want to live again. You gave me a glimpse of what life could be." She paused, her voice breaking. "I fell in love with you. You saved me, and you gave me 3 beautiful children. I'll always be grateful for that." I sighed. For a while, we just sat there, not moving. Finally, Jack cleared his throat. "What now, Phil?" I turned to him, tired. "Jack, I've been betrayed twice in my life. Both times I lost my best friend." Sally started sobbing. "No, no, no." The room was silent. Sally cried. Jack and I had tears in our eyes. Jack asked quietly, "Are you sure, Phil? You want to throw it all away over one mistake?" Sally lifted her head, a flicker of hope in her eyes. I knew what I had to say would end our marriage, but I couldn't let the lie stand. I shook my head. "The mistake wasn't just one, Jack." I looked at Sally, my voice firm. "Sally and her boss, Debbie, have a couple of girlfriends they go out with when they're out of town. I found out, and I didn't take it well." Sally sighed, closed her eyes, and shook her head, sinking deeper into her chair, looking even paler than before. I turned to Jack. "Does that answer your question?" I asked. Jack stood up slowly, his eyes full of sorrow as he looked at Sally. "You're my daughter, and I should love you, but I've lost all respect for you. Your actions." He trailed off, unable to find the words, just shaking his head. Sally reached out, but Jack pulled away. He looked at me and said firmly, "Phil, you don't deserve this. Do what you have to do, but don't hurt her." "I couldn't take it anymore," I replied. "No, Jack, I'm beyond that. But if it makes you feel better, take this." I slipped the knife back into its sheath and handed it to him. Jack accepted it silently, then turned to leave, his shoulders slumped, and I could tell he was already thinking about how to tell Emily. When the door closed behind him, the phone rang, but neither of us moved or spoke. The ringing eventually stopped, and the silence was deafening. Finally, I broke it, staring blankly ahead. "I thought the cops would be here this morning, not your father." Sally flinched and stumbled over her words. "Debbie and I told them to say we were attacked outside the bar. We hoped if they kept quiet, you wouldn't call their wives." I processed this, realizing I was free. There was no way their story would hold up for a moment. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but then I remembered everything was falling apart around me. "So, where are they now?" I asked flatly. Sally cleared her throat, fidgeting in her chair. "They're still in the hospital under observation. You hurt them badly. John has a broken nose, cheekbone, and ribs. Craig has a dislocated jaw, broken teeth, and a concussion." "Don't forget their balls," I replied bluntly. Sally, fear filled her eyes. No, you really hurt them." She paused, then added, "I didn't know you were so cruel." "Phil, did you have to do that?" I stared at her incredulous. "You're defending those fools?" I said sarcastically. Before she could respond, the phone rang again. "You should answer it," I said, heading to the bathroom. "It's probably for you." I washed my face, looking at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and puffy. I looked as worn down as I felt. It had been a sleepless night. Back in the kitchen, Sally was standing there, staring at the phone. Slowly, she hung it up and collapsed into a chair. When I sat back down, she spoke, her voice distant. "Did you have to tell Debbie's husband?" I shrugged. Why shouldn't I? He already called John and Craig's wives and kicked Debbie out. She's going to need a lawyer if she wants to see her daughter. Sally started crying again. Crap, crap, crap. Through her tears, she looked up at me and said it was all my fault. I laughed bitterly. "Oh, that's just perfect." I paused. "Tell me, Sally, who introduced you to John and Craig? It was Debbie, wasn't it?" Through sniffles, she asked, "How did you know?" I smiled grimly. "When I told Josh about what you and Debbie did last night, he didn't believe me, called me a liar, accused me of trying to ruin his marriage. But when I mentioned John Harrison's name, he turned pale and started swearing." First time I ever saw him angry. I paused. You told me years ago that Debbie's second marriage was strained and she was estranged from her parents. Well, she has a sister upstate she doesn't talk to either. I took a breath. About a year ago, Josh was auditing a company and met Sarah, Debbie's sister. They hit it off, and one night Sarah invited him to dinner with her husband, Dave. Sarah had a story to tell. I looked at Sally, whose face had gone white with shock. Turns out Dave was Debbie's first husband. She cheated on him throughout their marriage. He found out, kicked her out, and filed for divorce. I stopped, watching Sally's reaction. Debbie never told Josh any of this, and guess who she had an affair with during her first marriage? That's right, John Harrison. Sally froze. I continued. When I mentioned John's name, Josh put the pieces together and realized Debbie had been doing the same thing to him that you did to me. No wonder he threw her out. I took a deep breath. And like Josh, I'm wondering how long you've been fooling around with me, I said firmly. Sally cried again. Oh my God, Phil. It was just John and Craig, just during our shopping trips. Please believe me. I hadn't thought about anyone else until Debbie mentioned it. Before our first shopping trip, she sat there twirling a handkerchief, crying and begging. Please, Phil, I don't know how I ended up here. It's like I woke up from a nightmare when I walked into the bathroom and saw you there. I didn't say anything, just looked at her grimly. Encouraged, she spoke quickly. I knew Debbie liked to play, but I didn't expect her to hook up with anyone on our trip. She paused, biting her lip. John showed up at the restaurant. Debbie said she'd known him since high school, but I suspected that wasn't true. He was charming, flirted, danced with both of us, complimented me a lot. I had a few more drinks than usual, and when his hands got too familiar on the dance floor, I pretended not to notice. Later, Debbie went with John to the room next to ours. I realized she set the whole thing up. The walls were thin, and I could hear them all night. That explains why you were like that when you came home, right? I looked at her with disgust. Sally, you're unbelievable. Sally hung her head and wiped her eyes. The next morning, John was gone. We had breakfast, and Debbie went on and on about their night together, raving about him the whole way home. She paused, then added, Over the next few months, Debbie and I had lunch a couple times a week. She'd always talk about John and how much fun they had. That's when I first heard about his wart, Sally said softly. Debbie joked I should try it, but at first I just laughed it off. The more she talked, though, the more the idea stuck in my head. A few months later, when another shopping trip came up, Debbie confessed that John really wanted to be with me, and she didn't mind. I laughed, but I asked her what she'd do if I went along with it. Sally continued. She said John had a friend, Craig, who would keep her company. I didn't say no, though I don't know why. I told her I'd think about it, but I wasn't sure I could. Sally looked at me, but I just stared back blankly. I knew it was wrong, Phil, but I thought I could do it, and no one would ever know. She looked down again, her voice soft. That Saturday night, John and Craig came to the restaurant. We had dinner, drinks, and then went to a nightclub. We split into couples, and I ended up with John. I'd had enough to drink by then and convinced myself it was fine. Everyone was having a great time. Later we went back to the motel, and John and I went to our room while Debbie and Craig went to theirs. Sally fell silent, staring at her hands. I finally spoke dismissively. So, was it what you expected, Sally? Sally looked at me with tears in her eyes. It was fine. It wasn't better than what we have, but it was exciting because it was wrong, and I could pretend to be someone else. You mean it wasn't just okay? I said bitterly. He turned you on so much that you forgot about your husband at home, the one who takes care of the kids so you could be alone? Sally turned away, fighting a sob. Yes, she whispered. And Craig? My husband? I said sarcastically without looking at her. She replied, After we slept with John a few times, Debbie joked she was starting to miss him. I didn't think much about it, but the next trip, when we split into couples, I danced with Craig most of the night. Later, he came to my room and we spent the night together. It didn't seem like a big deal then. A couple of trips later, John and Craig swapped in the middle of the night. I didn't realize it first until I woke up and realized the man in my bed wasn't the one I started with. Sally looked at me sadly. I felt like two different people living in two different worlds. I liked our life, our family, but I got hooked on those weekends. I thought I could have both, and you'd never find out. How stupid was I? Damn stupid, I agreed. And then, when you saw me at the motel, I looked in the mirror and realized what I had become, she whispered. I stood up and looked down at her. Interesting story, Sally. Too bad it doesn't have a happy ending. Or maybe it does for you. I'm going to get the kids tonight. After Allie's asleep, we'll sit down with Jason and Jesse and tell them their parents will be living apart. I'll leave out the details to minimize the trauma. I'll sleep on the couch until I figure out what comes next. Sally shouted after me, crying, "Phil, don't do this. I love you. Please don't." I turned to her. "Why not?" Through sobs, she begged, "It was only a few nights a year. I never saw John or Craig outside those weekends. Please, Phil. Forgive me. Let me fix it." Forgive you? I shook my head. Forgive you for being promiscuous for other men a few nights a year? For giving away the thing you valued most, yourself? For destroying my trust? My belief that we belong to each other? I sighed. And how do you fix that? Can you undo it? Can you not be with John or Craig? Because that's what it takes to make it right. I looked around the kitchen. The family photos, the kids' drawings, Allie's baby chair in the corner, everything that made this place a home. I spent most of last night thinking about how I'll feel in 6 months, a year, or 5 years. I might forgive you, but I won't forget. I paused, my voice breaking. Every time I see you, I'll remember last night. Every time I hear your voice or your name, I'll think of it. And that, Sally, I said, is something I can't live with. I stood silently for a moment, barely noticing Sally rocking back and forth, crying, whispering, "No, please God, no." A few minutes later, I spoke softly. "Can you answer me one question, Sally?" She looked up at me, empty-eyed, like a condemned prisoner awaiting the sentence. "You lost the man who loved you more than anything. You lost the respect of your parents, my parents and me. You lost your job, and someday you'll have to explain to our children why you destroyed our family. Was it worth it?" After a long silence, broken only by her sobs, I turned and slowly walked out the door.